All right, we're going to do a series of videos right now explaining budgets largely so you all get kind of the 101 course as we keep talking about the stuff with these budget updates. So first we'll talk about the budget itself. It is actually three documents included in one budget: the revenue ordinance, the appropriations ordinance, any management ordinance. The revenue ordinance talks about how much money a city or municipality is going to collect, right? So this is where your taxes and your fees are. Your appropriations ordinance is how you intend to spend those funds. Are you putting more towards homelessness? Are you putting more towards certain programs? That's your appropriations ordinance. And then your management ordinance is your general rulemaking, right? So when I think about the management ordinance, it's what rules do you put in place for your budget process going forward or for the city going forward that lets people know that you're being responsible. So those are the three components. And as we talk about the different things related to the budget, you might hear me talk about the revenue ordinance, the appropriation ordinance, and the management ordinance. So just want to make sure you got that understood. Cool? That's part one. Part two is coming up. And we're going to talk about progressive versus regressive revenue and structural versus one-time revenue. All right? See you soon. All right. Part two, different kinds of revenue. So you hear people talk about progressive versus regressive revenue. Largely what that's about is who it hits, right? When you're paying revenue, someone has to pay for it. Your progressive revenue is when you model it in a way that those who have more, typically the ultra wealthy is how it's being framed, pay their fair share. An example of this is the fair tax, right? The governor had tried to move it and have us vote on it a number of years back. What that would have done is establish a graduated tax, meaning the more you make, the more you pay. So if you don't make as much, you're not paying as much into the taxes, right? So that's progressive. It's thinking about who's most impacted. Regressive taxes are those that are felt by those who are in most need of help. Those are the most marginalized, the lowest income. So typically a lot of your fees that have come up, like your garbage fee is one that hits everyone. So if you're not making a lot, you're still paying into it in a way that has a disproportional impact based on your income. So when we talk about that, I just wanted to frame that for you. So as we talk about some of the fees that are more aggressive, we're also thinking about ways to protect those who are most harmed. So for example, the garbage tax has a senior discount, right? A senior pays half of what everyone else would. But we think about those things as we're trying to model what revenue can look like. All right, so as we're looking at all the different forms of revenue, I'm also thinking about that lens. One-time fees or one-time revenue are things like our ARPA funds, right? Those are the revenue grants that were provided by the federal government during COVID. They gave us enough funds to pay for programs and people up until 2026. So if we were to pull back some of those funds and programs, right? One example is a guaranteed basic income, right? Folks of low income getting checks, that's going to run out in 2026. If that were to be lessened or removed to fill in the gap because we have such a deficit, it would do so right now, but it would only do it one time. So when we think about revenue, we want structural revenue because what we know is every year the deficits are going to continue to get bigger. So the revenue should keep on coming in order to pay for services that people need. All right. So that's your regressive versus progressive, your structural versus your one-time revenue. So just wanted to frame that for you all. Next, we'll talk efficiencies in part three. All right. Now, you guys learned what the budget ordinances are. You learned about what revenue is and a different way we look at it. Now let's talk efficiencies. So efficiencies come in a variety of ways, but ultimately what we're talking about is what you do to save funds. So when we talk about efficiencies, people mean cuts, and that could be cuts in headcount in people that do the jobs, or furloughs, which are having people work less days to save funds that way, or cuts to programs, right? Making sure that programs that we're funding maybe are scaled down a bit. And so that's part of the conversation that's happening with the colleagues in the city council as well. It's thinking about, is furlough something that we're going to ask of folks who are the frontline workers on the ground doing your work, your streets and sand, your CPD, your fire department, right, your tree trimmers, all the folks that do all the services that we do to maintain a city, asking those folks to work less. And the concern there that many of us have is if you do that, it means a drop in services. So you get less services where you're still being asked to pay more taxes. That's concerning. The other thing is layoffs. That's when you're actively telling people and getting rid of folks that have been working for the city and continue to work for the city. Both of those things for me are concerning. Layoffs clearly is something I don't support. I think the workers on the ground, typically union workers, but the workers on the ground doing the frontline service aren't the ones that should bear the brunt because they're trying to figure out how to solve this budget. But you can look at programs and efficiencies, right? So something that I've been calling for some time now are independent audits of the departments to make sure they're efficient and effective. You start with the largest costing department and work your way down. And the largest one is the Chicago Police Department. Now, those funds are largely headcount and overtime. The amount of overtime we pay and police misconduct settlements balloon. And so what I believe is we need to look and see what we're asking officers to do, because we place so much responsibility on them that they're getting burned out and they're doing things that I don't think should be their responsibility. I think their core function should be investigations, apprehension, and emergency response when appropriate. They do those things, but they also do somebody's parking in a permit parking zone, or there's homeless folks or substance use disorder, people who have substance use disorder. We call police for that when I think in reality other departments should handle that so officers can focus on their core function. But when I look at the management ordinance, part of what I want to do is start the independent studies and audits of all departments to figure out where we can find efficiencies so we can be better going forward. All right. Next, we're going to talk about the pension payment. All right. So we've gone over the budget ordinances. We've talked about revenue, progressive versus regressive. We've talked about efficiencies. Now let's talk about the pension payment. So the reason why these deficits are larger and larger every single year are because mayors in the past and city councils in the past weren't paying the pension payments. So pension payments are things that were mandated. Mayors would not raise taxes to pay those back in the day. And what ultimately happened is the payment debt kept growing so much so that every year it amortizes. So think about your credit cards, right? Your interest continues to grow and it keeps getting worse and worse if you don't make the payments to even cover the minimum balance. That's what ultimately happened here in the city of Chicago. It got so bad that the city started selling off assets to try to cover the gap temporarily, right? So in order to get $1 billion up front, the city sold off the parking meters for 75 years, right? And we've lost on all that revenue just for the one-time payment of $1 billion to cover a gap, which ultimately did not help in the long run because those funds didn't go back to paying the pension. They went to paying for services and being spent, right? We sold off the Skyway to try to cover that gap. So what we're seeing now is a credit card that has been maxed out, the city not being able to pay the interest even on that payment, and ultimately that debt continuing to grow out in a way that is fundamentally unsustainable unless you're making these advanced payments, right? So what's being called a supplemental payment is really a forward payment because we're not even paying our minimum. So the $272 million in this budget that is being used to make that forward payment is necessary. If you were to discount that, just lessen it by 27 million, 10%, it would cost $380 million over the next 30 years. So what we are doing here is making sure the responsible parts of the budget are in there so things don't get worse. Our deficits are going to get bigger year over year. We want to make sure we make the forward pension payments and have the structural revenue, and sometimes that does involve property tax, to make sure we are paying that, because if not, it's going to get worse. So that's just a little background to let you all know. Feel free, if you have any questions, to put them anywhere. You can post them up here, and I'm happy to answer them in future videos. But that's kind of like our 101 series here, so you all kind of understand as I'm providing all the updates. Hope you're doing okay. Stay safe. Talk to you soon.